Hello, and welcome back to Post Traumatic Revelations. I am your host, Afrah Caraballo. Today, we are looking at depression, what it is, how we get it, who can get it, and ways to deal with it. Now, I've danced with the idea of addressing depression for years now. In the classes that I've taught, in the books that I've written, in the personal and professional conversations that I've had, just the word depression can evoke so many thoughts and images. The label of depression can trigger us in both negative and positive ways. It's an answer for some, it's an excuse for others. For some people, it brings clarity, an explanation for those unexplained symptoms, feelings, thoughts. And for other people, it's the reason why they just can't do this or can't do that. So, the politics of diagnosing or labeling someone is a very delicate matter. The DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's a mouthful, right? Well, this manual is a tool, and like most tools, it's also a weapon. So it must be used with caution. The power and ability to label or diagnose someone can have powerful and lasting effects on their life. So, my dance with this idea of addressing depression has paused at this episode. I say pause because it's an ongoing conversation, an ongoing dance, if you will. Mental health is not a subject that I take lightly. I'm very passionate about mental illness. And I truly, truly believe that we all have the ability to heal. I truly believe that mental illness is something that we can heal and recover from if we have the appropriate permission and support in our lives. So, while this is by no means an exhaustive conversation, it is the start of what I hope will be an ongoing effort toward healing emotional and psychological wounds. So, depression. What is a depression? The word depression comes from the Latin word deprimere, to press down. A depression is a dip on a horizontal surface, a hollowed or sunken area, a depressed down thing or a lowered thing, as in the Great Depression, where the economy was lowered. There was a drop in the economic status of so many. So, depression, in the emotional and psychological sense, is about the pressed down or depressed thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, a pushing down or ignoring of a need or multiple needs in some cases. Sadness is an unavoidable part of life. We all feel sad at some point. Sadness occurs when we feel a loss of comfort, a loss of our sense of safety, our sense of peace. Sadness happens when something or someone is lost and cannot be easily recovered or restored, and in some cases can never be recovered or restored. So there are levels or degrees of loss, from the loss of comfort to the loss of life. As babies, we cry out for help. to restore our level of comfort or equilibrium in the scientific form. And ideally, someone answers the call, someone responds. We are fed, our diapers are changed, we are held, we are comforted, we're reassured, and that feeling of safety and equilibrium is restored. There's also a kind of loss that comes from the death of a loved one or a comrade, a battle buddy, a pet, the ending of a relationship, a divorce, whether it happened to you or you initiated, it's still a loss, the loss of a limb. None of these things can be replaced or easily healed. Unlike food or clothing, rest, shelter, or a hug, some support and recovery requires professional help. Depression, in its more serious forms, will require the help of medical professionals, psychological professionals, therapists. Some losses are so deep and so personal, they can never be replaced, while others can be replaced, like a car, for example, or a house, get a new job. And that often helps with the healing and recovery process. So while sadness is inevitable, depression doesn't always have to be. Depression is prolonged sadness, unaddressed loss, or ignored discomfort, or pressed down and pushed down thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we naturally feel in response to loss. So, when the brain and the body registers a loss, there is this feeling of discomfort, and there's this behavioral response in an attempt to restore that comfort. Very simply, when you feel bad, you want to feel better. So there's a chemical response to the loss of comfort. There's stress hormones that are surging through the body, sending messages to parts of the body to behave in ways to signal for help. So there's emotional pain, psychological pain, anguish, verbal signals, physical signals, and these signals and behaviors will vary depending on who or where you are in the world. The experience of loss and its resulting sadness, like every human emotion, can and will vary based on who you are, based on your place and space in the world, based on your perceived sense of safety and your perceived sense of worth. But regardless of who you are or where you are, you feel sad when you're hungry and there's no food, when you're tired and there's no safe place to rest, when you're cold and wet and there's no dry, warm clothes. No matter who you are or where you are, the loss of a loved one, a child, a pet, a partner, a job, a limb, will cause discomfort and sadness. No human is immune to feelings of sadness. And for every one of us, there is a physiological, chemical response to that sadness. And this chemical response, this physical response, can trigger negative thoughts, emotions, behaviors that can become labels and diagnoses known as depression. Depression is a kind of coping strategy. A coping strategy that uses an array of responses made up of varying combinations of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Some of them include ruminating, avoiding, withdrawing, numbing out, difficulty concentrating, or difficulty remembering, or disinterested in things that you used to enjoy. In some extreme cases, there are thoughts of self harm, suicidal ideations, or even suicide attempts. But all of these responses are developed and designed to restore a sense of equilibrium, a sense of peace and safety, regardless of what we think from the outside looking in, or when we're not in those sad and depressed states. Depression is prolonged sadness, unaddressed or invalidated and dismissed pain, suffering, and loss, accidental or not, intentional or unintentional, doesn't matter. Accidental punches hurt, and stray bullets can kill. So it doesn't matter why you're crying for help are not answered. As a baby, as a child, as a developing brain and body, we just want to be comfortable. The living organism always seeks equilibrium and stability and safety, and human beings are no different. So when we feel discomfort, we act to restore that comfort. If we cannot restore it, when the crying doesn't help, when those calls go unanswered, or when sucking a finger or asking for help or attempting to help to self soothe, when none of this works, the brain tries to rationalize and explain, and it starts to explore other possible ways to restore the feelings of peace and safety. Maybe if I cry louder or scream harder, fight harder, maybe if I ask the other parent for help, or maybe if I ask the auntie, or maybe if I asked a neighbor, maybe if I asked a teacher or a sibling, or maybe I just go to sleep. Maybe just do nothing. Why bother? Maybe just numb out. Depression, like anything involving humans, is an expression on a spectrum. There are levels or degrees of sadness and depression in the ranking somewhere between disappointed on one end and suicide on the other. We feel disappointed when we don't get something we want. We may feel sad when we don't get something we really want. We may even go to sad and agitated when we don't get something we need. We get sad and angry when we don't get something we feel like we really need. So, the more urgent the perceived need or loss, the more severe the emotional and psychological distress and the response to that stress. So, how do we get depression? It's not a thing that you can buy in a store. You can't just go to the grocery store and ask for a bag or a box of depression. You can't go to Target or Walmart and ask for a bag of depression or a big box of depression. So, how do we get it? Well, we become sad when a perceived need is not met. When that sadness or that feeling of sadness is ignored or dismissed, we not only feel sad, but we also feel confused and a little mad. And then we start to act out. When this new bundle of combination of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors is ignored, dismissed, or invalidated, we start to internalize the experience. We go inside of ourselves and try to organize this distress, this emotional and psychological mess. We try to organize the disorder, in this case, the depressive disorder. It is the brain's job to organize and make sense of what's going on in the body. But when the brain is too stressed and overwhelmed, certain parts stop working. This breakdown can cause mental illness, mental disorders, because depression is always about unresolved, invalidated loss of something or someone precious to us. We find ways to try to resolve and validate and heal the damage. We get depression when we ignore our sadness. We get depression when our sadness is dismissed and invalidated. We get depression when our losses are not properly mourned. We get depression when we are forced to just let it go instead of laying it down, laying it to rest with respect, honoring what was lost. We get depression when we are forced to just get over it instead of having the support and the time that we need to get through it. I believe depression is caused by our most dismissive attitudes. We've become so dismissive and impatient with loss, with sadness. We've come intolerant of vulnerability and social connection. Over this past year, we've been forced into different levels of isolation, different levels of inactivity. We've lost some freedoms, we've lost loved ones, and in some ways, it feels like time stood still, and in other ways, it feels like time is still just passing us by, and we don't really have time to mourn what's lost. We're so busy rushing to figure out the new normal that I don't know that we're really paying attention to what's been lost. But we're social beings, and because of this, we are physically in need of connection. There is a physical need for socialization and socializing. As humans, we're social creatures, and dare I say it, codependent. And while we've made this a mean, ugly, dirty, judgmental word, we are codependent. Every human being was cut away from another human being. Think about that. We literally came from the body of another human, every single one of us. No matter who you are, how rich you are, how poor you are, big, small, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Jew, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist. Every human being was cut away from another human. And we never, ever outgrow our need for a connection to another person. So the loss of a relationship will leave a mark. There is no lab test or x ray for depression, but there are very real signs, symptoms, changes in our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors that are associated with this unresolved, unaddressed, invalidated, dismissed sadness, grief, and loss. So, we've talked about what depression is and how we might come to have the label or the diagnosis of depressive disorder. Now, let's look at who can get it. Well, technically, any human anywhere can be sad and consequently depressed. But who has permission? Who has permission to be sad, to have their grief and loss validated? Who has permission to be sad, grief stricken, depressed? Children? Maybe, depending on the parents, depending on the adults in their lives, maybe depending on their age. Some kids are told, stop crying. Boys don't cry. Nothing's wrong. It's not that big of a deal. Suck it up. Move on. Women? Hmm, sometimes, depending on who and where they are in the world. But women tend to have more permission to be depressed than men. Men? No, they're not allowed to be sad. Men aren't allowed to be depressed. And so when men do have depression, we tend to see more behaviors that are like irritability and anger or abusing alcohol. But the sadness and the vulnerability and those characteristics are more acceptable for women. And we get these messages. Who else? So, rich people, usually, but not too long. We don't really tolerate the wealthy sadness. I remember listening to this interview by Chrissy Teigen, and she was talking about all the outpouring of support around a recent loss. But just a few days later, people felt the need to get back to attacking her. That Meghan Markle or Prince Harry, it's like there's a certain expectation that a certain level of wealth and affluence allows you some kind of immunity to sadness or loss, and that's not the case. Every human can be sad, and every human can suffer loss, and every human deserves the time and space and support needed for healing and recovery. So, who else? Poor? Nah, the poor don't usually get the luxury to sit it out and mourn and be depressed. Maids, domestic workers? No, not really. CEOs, doctors, nurses? Maybe. Maybe they get permission, but it's kind of pop a pill and move on. There's this unspoken idea of who gets permission and who doesn't. Blue collar workers versus white collar workers. affluent versus unemployed or uneducated or those we consider less valuable. So we have these varying expectations and how we internalize our sense of self worth, our status, our place in space, how our needs are met early on in life will most certainly inform how we validate ourselves, how we validate our own grief and loss as we get older. So, if you were nurtured and supported and encouraged and validated and cared for as a baby, as a child, as a young adult, if your needs were consistently met, your sense of peace and safety relatively maintained, there's a pretty good chance you do not have depression. But if you have a history of dismissed or invalidated grief, loss, sadness, if you have a history of abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, if your pain was ignored, minimized, dismissed, then there's a very good chance you do have depression. See, we learn who we are and where we belong, how to behave, how to think, how to feel, and how to express those feelings by how we are treated. The messages we receive, we learn that it's okay to cry, to hurt, to feel sad, to be vulnerable. If we learn that our thoughts, our feelings, our pain matter, we learn that the world is a safe and supportive place. Even in the worst times, we learn that we are not alone in our pain and our suffering, and we heal more readily. Our wounds become scars. The bleeding and the pain subside and often stop. But if we are raised with dismissive, invalidating, and discouraging messages, we learn to dismiss and invalidate our depression. We learn to push it down. We learn to hide the pain. We learn that our pain doesn't matter. Our losses aren't important. They're not important enough to get the support, to ask for time, to ask for space. But again, because we were born trusting, we were born knowing we are deserving, we were born daring the world to love us and care for us. There's a discord, there's a disconnect, there's an internal conflict that forces us to think and feel and act in ways that are maladaptive. Remember, depression is a coping strategy designed to cope with the internal disorders caused by trauma, grief, loss, abuse, neglect. The internalized beliefs about our place in space, our very right to love, hope, and healing. These beliefs can become so distorted in the fog of depression, worthlessness, and self hatred, and self harm, hopelessness, and helplessness, numbness all seem normal. In the depths of depression, feelings and behaviors that cause self harm feel right. Depression is not stupid. Depression is not dumb. All of the negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are based on some reality, some real experience. For many of us, if you don't try, you can't fail. If you don't love, you can't get hurt. These are beliefs philosophies that are designed to protect, but in the long run, they end up causing more pain and more damage. I often ask my clients to describe their depression, and often they say it's like a cloud or a fog. And over time, I've learned to ask about the size of this cloud, the weight of this cloud, the colors of this cloud. And very often they are described as just this heavy nothingness in some of the milder cases. And there's this gray heaviness in those more moderate cases. And in those more severe cases, they describe it as this darkness, this heavy darkness. And for so many, there's this feeling of being lost in this fog or lost in this haze and this numbness. But then there are those cases where the mind and the body have reached their limits. It's just enough is enough. And there's this feeling, even the expression of just fuck it all. And I call it the fuck it factor. And for some, it's an ongoing joke, but for others, it's like, exactly. There's this intense response of, you get it exactly right. But there's this tension in the fuck it factor. This is when people are suicidal and are talking about being done and over it and finished. They're saying things like, F this and F that, and nobody cares about me, and I'm worthless, and it's hopeless, and nobody's worth it. It's not worth it to live. Nobody needs me. Nobody wants me. Just essentially, fuck it all. This is a very important, sensitive, and intense time. But on the other side of this discussion, there's this lighter, more relieving, yeah, fuck it. If it's not worth living for, then it's not worth dying for. This is potentially where the healing begins, where healing can start. This is the break in the clouds, a break in the fog, where the same words can carry a different meaning and a different light and a different path. And so, from the intense, angry, and desperate, fuck it all, to the hopeful and possible, fuck it all. Let's start over. Let's see what's possible, what's new. If it wasn't worth living for, it's not worth dying for, then let's just scratch it and start all over. I've heard some of my clients describe it as a psychological and emotional suicide, that all of that is dead and gone and I'm starting over. Then that is a pretty powerful and amazing place to be. Dare I say, exciting place to be. And I hope that we all find that space of new possibility, going from hopeless to hopeful and powerless to powerful and lost to found and possibility. Thank you so much. Thank you again for your time, your attention, and your permission. Until next time, be well.